Hello, welcome to Secure Talk, your trusted source of information on the latest threats, trends, tools, and technology related to cybersecurity and compliance.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Secure Talk. My name is Mark Schreiner, and I'll be your host for this episode of Secure Talk. Today, we're going to be talking to Sagi Brody, who is the CTO of Opti9, a leading hybrid cloud solution provider specializing in digital transformation, data storage, DevOps, backup and recovery, compliance-driven migration, managed cloud services, and cloud-first application services. That is a lot, and we're probably not going to talk about all that, but we are going to talk to Sagi about some of those offerings, and we're going to drill down on cyber resilience and data protection services. But before we do that, I'm going to say hello to Sagi. Sagi, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Mark.
Awesome. Hey, I think that you mentioned you're based down in Boca Raton.
I am. Yep.
Yeah. I don't know exactly how close that is to Miami, but from what I understand, the mayor of Miami is doing a great job in terms of facilitating and encouraging the expansion of the startup community and bringing in or welcoming IT companies into the area. Are you getting any carryover effect, or is there anything similar to that in Boca Raton?
I would say not directly. I mean, Boca is its own sort of tech mecca in its own right. A lot of big infrastructure companies that are based out of here. Miami, though, is certainly sort of seeing an influx. I would say there's a bunch of security companies that are based out of there, and I think Miami is acting as a hub for a tremendous amount of talent coming in from Latin America.
Oh, that's interesting because I mean, one of the demographic kind of trends that we see from here is that apparently Florida is the fastest growing state or one of the fastest growing states. And on the West Coast, obviously, California is losing a big chunk of its population every year. A lot of that is attributed to, people on the East Coast, they want to retire. Some people out here, they want to retire and they want to go find the sun. And then also to some of the favorable taxes and stuff like that. But what you're saying is part of that growth probably is because of the growth of the IT community. And then you said an influx of talent from South America.
Yeah, actually, it's an interesting conversation. So where I live, the community that I'm in is, it's probably 50% folks from the Northeast, lots of folks in tech, lots of startup founders. I'd say there's a little bit from Chicago, a little bit less from California, but we do have a large number of folks from Brazil, Argentina, even Colombia, and plenty of tech founders from there as well.
Well, that's also interesting from another point of view, because one of the biggest challenges out here on the West Coast, in tech in general, but especially in cybersecurity, is finding good talent, which could actually lead into the conversation about managed services, because one of the arguments for managed services is, hey, trying to go out and hire the right subject matter expertise can be very challenging, right? And you have that person 24/7. Well, you have them on the clock as an FTE versus, outsourcing. We'll get to that a little bit later. But what you're saying then is in Florida, it might be easier to get some qualified talent for less than West Coast prices because you have, I guess, these people are immigrants, or are they on some type of business visa, or what's the situation?
Yeah, I mean, the folks that I, excuse me, the folks that I typically interact with are probably, the ones that I've met here are probably more on the executive level. And I would imagine that they still have a large number of staff back in South America. But, nearshoring as an outsourced option is sort of the latest craze.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm seeing my peers and other managed service providers really looking at those South American countries that are on the same time zone, that speak good English, that have a great skill set, as a really good option.
Are you also, does Opti9 provide, is it nearshoring, or is it basically everybody is here in the US?
I'd say like over 90% of our employees are US based. We have a few developers who are outside the country, but we have a big focus within providing services to organizations that have very strict compliance requirements, export control, U.S. persons. We work with defense contractors, so we have to be, very specific in who provides us services. So for us, today it's all U.S. based.
Okay, so when you initially engage with a prospective customer, what's the typical scenario? Do they reach out to you and say, "Hey, we're looking for some type of managed service provider for X service"? I mean, because I went through a whole, laundry list of different services that you guys provide. Or are you reaching out to organizations, say, "Hey, we provide all these services. Are any of these of interest to you?" Or do you reach out and say, "Hey, let's talk about cyber resilience"? I mean, what's the typical scenario, or is there a typical scenario?
Well, I mean, I'd say it's a little bit of everything. And we do have a lot of folks that are calling us and specifically asking for the services that we provide that are related to cyber. And I would say of the laundry list that you mentioned, you know, I would say backups as a service and disaster recovery as a service are the ones that are relevant. And a lot of organizations are looking to check boxes to ensure that they are compliant with the frameworks that their industries have subscribed to, and ensuring that they're doing what they need to do. Um, Other organizations are acknowledging that in order to ensure that their infrastructure is secure, that they just want to pass. They don't have an appetite to own it internally and to take ownership and accountability that their infrastructure is going to be resilient and secure and performant. And they'd rather just pass ownership and accountability to a third party. So I'd say it's two for the organizations that do have an appetite to manage their production. Usually, we're providing backups or disaster recovery as sort of a bolt-on, which is like a good, really nice place to kind of draw the line in the sand where you can shift ownership to a vendor for some of your requirements, but still maintain, running your own systems. And for others, they're just like, you guys take everything. We're gonna take our IT resources and focus on adding business value.
Is there a particular sweet spot in terms of size, maturity, so on, in terms of the types of organizations that you feel those services specifically, are more appropriate for?
Yeah, I'd say the mid market enterprise is where our focus is, and I'd say enterprises that have a few hundred users, maybe hundreds to thousands. Typically, what we see is it's not they're never clean IT environments.
Hmm.
They either have interesting network requirements, um, interesting compliance requirements, some edge platforms, legacy platforms, and applying a traditional disaster recovery strategy or backup strategy to those types of environments can be challenging. And so, at the higher up the stack of enterprise organizations you go, the more gotchas there are, and
Hmm.
really, frankly, the less vendors that are out there that can hit those touch points. And so, we kind of focus on that. If you're looking at disaster recovery, you can't provide disaster recovery as a service and only hit 85% of their critical platforms. It's kind of all or nothing. And you definitely don't want to go back to the person and say, oh well, why don't you virtualize that workload? It's kind of like, yeah, well, we know that if we would have if we could have, but it has this weird scenario.
So when you start to have this initial conversation around cyber resilience and disaster recovery, what are the main questions that you're going to ask of the customer, and what are the questions that they're going to ask from you?
Well, those conversations typically start with what are your requirements for your RTOs and RPOs, and a lot of this is educational in nature. And I think
Mhm.
the industry and market has matured. Years ago we would be explaining to people how backups and disaster recovery are not the same, and how they are sort of two different strategies designed for two different scenarios. Backup providing you with like immediate file restore and providing like long-term archival data or maybe a legal hold, and disaster recovery really being a strategy that provides you with a recourse, if your systems go down, or if there's a ransomware attack, or whatever the case may be, and you need to ensure that your applications are up and running in seconds. So it's kind think of it as kind of the difference. When you think of backups, you think of restore. When you think of disaster recovery, you should think of resume.
Okay, that's interesting because I actually thought that in a ransomware attack where they encrypt all your data, having that backup would be the way to go. But what you're saying is the disaster recovery which I guess what it was just making sure that the whole system is, instead of the data, is back online. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so with disaster recovery, um, we are replicating all of the applications and systems to our service. So or we'll use third party clouds like AWS as well. And there's pros and cons, another conversation. But we will replicate all of the data and the servers in their sort of native format to another platform which is capable of running them. So on a backup system, you're going to use cheap and deep cold storage for archival. With disaster recovery, the infrastructure needs to be just as performant or better than what you have in production, so that it can handle running your infrastructure. And then what we do then is we pre-configure all of the dependencies, and so we want to be sure that the firewalls are the same as production, and the configurations are synced. So security, network, and authentication, all of that is up and running in advance, so that we can just spin up your servers and your applications will continue to function. Easier said than done. I think disaster recovery is really about consumption. It's really a network conversation. How are users going to consume it? And the more complex people's infrastructures get these days, years ago when your critical production environment was in site A and you would replicate everything to site B, it wasn't as challenging. Today, when the definition of your critical production environment is some applications in a private cloud, some in public cloud, some in third-party SaaS. Maybe you have a complex SD-WAN network. It is much more difficult to provide resilience of that, which is why outsourcing to a vendor that focuses on that obviously is becoming more of a chosen solution.
Yeah, and I noticed on your website that you, I guess, promote the idea of providing these services for hybrid cloud scenarios. And I'm wondering, I mean, so I can see that if everything was 100% cloud, I could see that it would be simpler to kind of get replicate the services that they're running, or the platform that they're running, the tools, the apps, everything like that, and then just flip a switch and have them go from there. But how do you manage the stuff that's on-prem?
Actually, the on-prem stuff in a way is easier, I would say, than some of the public cloud applications. So yeah, if you're building a cloud native application using public cloud platform as a service, it is actually a lot more complicated to ensure resilience, unless you have a huge team like a Netflix and you can build it into the app. Again, easier said than done. On-prem is easier today because we can use third-party data movers. Like we partner with Veeam, which is a backup and replication software tool, where we're like one of their largest providers in the world. And that software does the data movement real well. It's going to replicate all of the data. They now support CDP, so real-time replication. And then we are providing all the wrappers around that, ensuring the RPOs are being met, working with our customers to pre-configure the consumption and build the runbooks. And today, because of hybrid, these things are much more complicated. You need a separate runbook for for a full site failover, a separate runbook for a partial site failover. For instance, if one server gets hit with ransomware and you want to use your DR site as an isolated recovery environment, you're not going to fail over the entire site. You want to fail over a minimum viable product. So you need a separate runbook for partial failover. And you also need a separate runbook for testing of your DR site, especially because of hybrid. If you boot up your applications in DR to test, and you haven't sort of fenced off that DR network from the rest of the world, and if your applications are interacting with like Salesforce or Workday or any other SaaS platform, you might start messing with your data in DR and actually poison your production data somewhere else, because they're all interconnected. And so we're very careful in creating runbooks per scenario, and understanding what the consumption strategy is for each one of those.
Sounds complex. And I want to ask you about the process of how you kick off an engagement, understand what infrastructure, apps, data that a prospective customer has, and how you kind of map that out. But first, you've talked a lot about like if something goes down because of malware, and we tend to think of cyber resilience oftentimes in terms of cyber threats. But I got to think in Florida, you guys have hurricanes that come in and things like that. Is the recovery process or the resilience strategy any different for physical threats?
Well, I would say no. The run. Well, it really depends. The recovery process is the same, but what we're trying to do is to in order to use the disaster recovery infrastructure as a viable option in response to a ransomware attack to ensure that your applications continue to function, you do have to do some work, at the onset and upfront so that you can use it for that scenario. And I think this is where people have a false sense of security. Lots of people out there, they think, "Oh, I have backups. I'm good. If I have a ransomware attack, I'm okay. I have a solution. Or I have a disaster recovery strategy. I'll be okay." But there's always, horrible assumptions out there about what you're capable of recovering from and how quickly. So with disaster recovery, one of the things we can do is we can set a journal for how far back in time we can instantly bring up the entire environment for. So obviously, that journal needs to be able to go back far enough to before there was the infection that actually took down the systems. It might not need to go as far back from the original infection, but just to the point of compromise. So that's the first thing I would say that's important. Um, Also, with disaster recovery, and with the services that we provide, it works the best if we can work hand in hand with our customers' MSSPs. When you think about umbrella protection for cybersecurity, the MSSPs that are providing, or even the in-house SOCs that are providing the proactive services, the threat detection, the threat protection, the security scans, that's proactive, but you still need a reactive solution as well. That's where we come in. And by pre-configuring the disaster recovery environment, it can be used as an isolated recovery environment to bring up the applications in a production capacity and also to do forensics. Um, but the biggest point I want to make in regards to all of this is that what we've seen in the marketplace recently as it relates to ransomware attacks is that we've seen attackers, when they get into organizations' IT environments, they're specifically looking for the backup and replication tools. They're first seeking them so that they can destroy any backups or any other means of recovery, obviously to increase their chance of being paid the ransom. And so
Mhm.
they're just like the techs that are out there, they're getting trained on these software tools so that they know how to log into them effectively and destroy everything, which is a new attack surface that really we don't think anyone is addressing.
That's yeah, I didn't think about that. It's like, hey, we've got a backup, but they found the backup before you activated the backup, and good luck. So, so back to the question I was going to ask before is when you first start an engagement with a prospective customer, and they have a hybrid environment and just a variety of apps, devices, locations, etc. How do you kind of figure out where to start, how to start, and move forward?
Yeah, I mean, we have a pretty straightforward process around it where we can ingest all the information that's relevant to giving them an idea of what an engagement would look like. So we do a ton of sort of consulting as part of our pre-sales engineering process. We ingest information, we give them some software to run that will profile their resource usage, and we translate that into a quote pretty quickly. Now, the devil's in the details when we get into the network integration and some of the dependencies. That's where there's more work to be done, but usually that's already into the actual implementation stage.
Okay, so like time wise, if we're a 200 seat organization, relatively kind of complex platform, like what are we talking about in terms of time to get a quote, and then if we accept a quote to actually deploy services?
Yeah, I mean,
Ballpark.
a lot of it also depends on the maturity of the organization. To
Mm.
what extent you know which your applications are really critical and maybe need disaster recovery versus which can be fine with backup. But I would say ballpark maybe a week to 3 weeks to implement. It could be as little as 4 weeks. It could be It could be 90 days.
Okay.
A lot of what we do is responsive to what your infrastructure stack looks like. We don't want to. We ensure that we're not forcing you to make any changes to your network, or your IPs, or your platforms. We're going to ensure that we can provide resilience and disaster recovery, regardless of what your requirements are. You hear a lot of people say, "Well, we can't use cloud because of X," where that's we can't go to public cloud because of Y. And so what we try to do is to provide as cloud services, disaster recovery as a services within your existing frameworks for security and compliance and platforms. Um, for instance, we do it for IBM i-series platforms and p-series, and physical servers. So we're not gonna say no to that.
Got you. What are your customers' biggest concerns before they start off an engagement? Like, I mean, what are the top 2 or 3 most critical questions that they say, "Hey, we're worried about this"?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we take a step back and start to think about why is there an influx of people calling us about backups and disaster recovery now, we realize that it's not that they have an increased need for backups and DR. It's that they are just more afraid of cyber attacks, and they want to ensure that they have a recovery, you know, a recovery option. Um, so we actually thought, well, what can we do? What can we do to better address that threat or that fear that they have more directly? And kind of thought about it, and going back to what I said before about if an attacker gets into your local software backup tool, they can do a lot of damage. We realize that we actually have a very interesting vantage point when we go and install and provide those backup and replication software tools at our customer sites. We do connect them back to our data lake, just so that we can do monitoring and billing and all sorts of other stuff and drive our portal. But we realized it was a really good data set to run machine learning against, to determine if someone is in the environment doing something suspicious.
Hmm.
So we launched this tool, this monitoring service called Observer a few months ago, and we're looking at changes that are happening within that software set. If someone changes retention settings on a backup, or modifies a job, or disables a job, or performs a deletion event, or even if the incremental change rate on a backup or replica changes, these are activities that might indicate that someone is within the environment, um, and that they're purposely looking to destroy recovery options in order to ransomware them. And so, if we can detect an attacker in the backup software, we could potentially prevent sort of like a legitimate ransomware attack before it happens. Um, the other interesting thing about that is when you think about backups and ransomware, a lot of people's minds go to immutability. Well, my backups are immutable, so they can't delete that, um, which is true. But a lot of people don't have great monitoring with their systems. If someone disabled the backup, they might not know. They might wait for their immutability timer to run out. More importantly, is there is no such thing as immutability when you start talking about disaster recovery and replication, just the way that it works. Which means if an attacker gets in to a customer's environment, they find these replication tools, they can destroy the entire DR site in seconds. And so we want to be able to track that. Um, and we now are doing something where we will automatically air gap the DR site in response to that sort of event.
Cool. Are you seeing any organizations or customers get or receive preferred rates because they're employing these type of services? I might say rates. I should talk about cyber insurance.
There's a lot of talk about that in the industry now, and there's a lot of potential partnerships that are just forming. I haven't seen anything that's sort of black and white. If you do this, you will get a better rate. But the onus on organizations of providing information to the insurance companies to fill out um, all this information, their security stance is just really getting much more detailed. So when we engage with an organization for these services, typically they'll send us those questionnaires and we will fill it out on their behalf. And obviously the services that we provide really hit a lot of the touch points that the insurance companies are looking for.
Is the process similar for achieving certain compliance certifications, credentials? So if we need to get HIPAA certified, actually I should just say be HIPAA compliance, or if we're looking for a SOC 2 certification. I mean, do you just do the questionnaire, or can you go a little bit further than that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say both. If they tell us at the onset what frameworks they're looking to adhere to or be compliant with, then we will advise them what services that we should provide to assist that. We will fill out we will review the questionnaires, and we will basically say, hey, these are components that we will take ownership and accountability for. These are the ones that are on you, and maybe these are some others that are on your MSSP or whoever. And when they do their yearly audits, we'll actually fill them out for them. HIPAA is certainly one that we deal a lot with, and we sign BAAs in response to all our services. And one thing about HIPAA that I don't think people realize is that you can actually get a HIPAA violation for data availability. So it's data theft, but also if your systems are down, if people can't look up medical records, you can actually be levied a HIPAA fine. And so resilience and availability is certainly important as well.
What I mean, I'm sure you have competitors, okay? And what does Opti9, what do you kind of put up as your USP or unique selling proposition or point in comparison to the competitors?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'd say one of them is, like I said before, we're focused on that mid-market enterprise where there are some gotchas, and in order to do that, you need to be able to build bespoke solutions. You need to be able to provide them with cloud services, you know, on the inside, from the inside out, with their existing MPLS provider or their network. And so, um, us having an appetite to customize and be flexible is important. We also, I would say, go deeper with managed services. Managed services is one of those terribly vague terms, just like the term cloud, that is conveniently vague for the vendors because everybody gets to define it the way that they think it should be defined. So it's really hard to look at two managed service providers and understand to what extent they're apples and oranges. For us, for us, we actually show a RACI matrix in our portal, and our customers can subscribe to that as there's changes, as we monitor new alerts and alarms. But to kind of be high level with it, we take full ownership of failover, full ownership of failback, write the run books. So I think we go much deeper. And then the security stuff I mentioned before, this machine learning service where we're actually looking at your backup and replication infrastructure for cyber attacks, and being able to integrate with XDR and SIM tools or MSSPs when we see suspicious activity, and air gap your DR infrastructure. Nobody else in the industry is doing that. We think it's very unique. And we have a playbook that we use with MSSP. So when you look at the NIST framework for cyber, we look at incident response as two companies, or an MSSP or a SOC and us, and we say, hey, when there is an event, we are going to boot up the isolated recovery environment. We're going to move forward with this run book, and we're going to kind of block and tackle for the security analysts to do forensics. We're going to buy them time by ensuring the application is available, and work with them to know when do we think the environment is now clean to fail back. The last thing you want to do when you get hit with an attack is to do vendor management. If you have a vendor that's providing security services and a vendor that's providing resilience, backups, DR, those vendors need to get together way in advance and work out sort of who's doing what when, if there is an attack, and what happens afterwards. So that's what we try to do. I think as well in the future there is this, that really should be one offering. Maybe it's a joint offering from two vendors, but if you think about a cyber recovery as a service, all of these things are going to be interconnected. So might as well work it out in advance.
Yeah, have that playbook ready,
Yeah.
and stuff takes a turn for the worst. You push a button, and your managed service providers come online and just take the ball and hopefully return it back to you. what could you walk me through a real life scenario? I'm not asking for any company names, of course, but just talk about something that happened to one of your customers and how what did they do, how did they respond, and how long did it take your team to respond, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you one that comes to mind, which is we had a customer that this is a while back, but this financial services organization, they got hit with ransomware. At that point in time, they were using Opti9 to provide them with offsite backups as a service, no disaster recovery, just backups. They got hit with ransomware, and the attackers did exactly what I said before. They seeked out all of their backups and recovery options. They destroyed them all, and then they ransomware their entire environment, and they effectively shut down their services. They called us and they said, "Hey, Opti9, you guys are providing the backups. Um, what do you see?" We logged into our backup server. We don't see any backups, and we looked, and all the backups were gone. This was before really immutability was something. But what we were doing at the time, what we still do is anything that's deleted from our side in our systems in our cloud, any backups that are deleted actually go into an air gapped recycle bin for a week. And so we were able to on the fly build them a DR environment, restore those backups from the air gap to that DR environment, set them up with some VPNs real quick, because this is all on the fly, and get their applications back up and running and get all their data back, which was I thought that was awesome.
One, how long did that take? And two, how did you prevent the bad guys from just going in and doing the same thing over again?
Yeah. Well, how long did it take? It probably took about 2 or 3 days, I would say. And again, that's sort of the difference between having disaster recovery, at the onset, pre-configured, pre-planned, versus dealing with it, and just trying to work through backups. Um, Once they were back up into their systems, they isolated these applications, just to these VPNs. They only connected through means which they were not using before. They didn't connect it back to their ADFS, and so they kind of worked backwards from isolation, and being able to get back in and run their business. And they kind of slowly reintegrated. I think they brought in a firm to do some forensics and find the root cause, which I'm not even sure of.
Awesome. Let me ask you this. Let's kind of jump off of the topic of cyber resilience and data protection and disaster recovery, et cetera. Just in general, what advice would you give to your customers and similar sized organizations in terms of preventing these ransomware attacks?
Well, one thing I would say is again, there's a just terrible amount of assumptions as it relates to cloud and just infrastructure and applications and SaaS. I think people really need to ask their vendors or their providers, to what extent they are securing their data for them, and to what extent it is the customer's responsibility. A good example is Office 365. People move from on-prem Exchange to Office 365, and they think that they are okay. Now it's in the cloud, and Microsoft's taking care of everything. I don't have to worry. Many people are surprised to learn that there is no inherent backup capability in Office 365. There is a recycle bin type folder, but you can't log into any interface and say, "I would like to restore this mailbox or this OneDrive directory or this SharePoint site to what it looked like a week ago or a month ago." You can't do that in the way that you can do it with a traditional backup and recovery tool. People don't realize that. They just make an assumption. It's Microsoft. It's resilient. It's protected, and that's just not the case. I mean, Microsoft is replicating your data and housing it in multiple data centers, so there's high availability, but you don't have that backup capability. Excuse me. So I think the same holds true. You'll find that same type of example across many, many, many different cloud platforms, or SaaS providers, and so you really need to get the story straight day one. And you have to understand these things before you make the decision to use a certain platform. You can't run to a SaaS and then go to apply your resilience requirements after you're already there.
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, I've had the conversation or overheard the conversation quite a few times where people are using AWS and they make the assumption that, oh, well, it's all safe then, it's all secure. And a lot of it comes down to, like, like you said, the devil's in the details. Have you configured everything in the appropriate manner? And oftentimes you need to work with a partner to who understands that environment to kind of optimize it for whatever you're trying to do in terms of DR or resilience. But so it makes a lot of sense in terms of just general IT cyber hygiene. Is there anything that anything else you would advise? I'm not even talking about the cloud element, but just in general, because you deal with a lot of different organizations. So the guys say, hey, okay, you've helped us optimize. You've taken over the DR stuff, with the backup stuff. You're taking care of that. But what else should we be doing as an organization to kind of prevent these types of attacks?
Yeah, I'd say that the broadest advice I can give is to, from an IT perspective, is to focus on complexity, and and one of the goals of IT these days should be trying to reduce complexity. Complexity is the killer, and there is certainly a ton of complexity sprawl. Sorry, as people go out there and use all these disparate platforms and applications. The problem with that is the more complex your sort of landscape of applications and software and infrastructures, the harder it is to ensure security and uptime and availability, and to apply any strategies against them. And so I do think that all the IT leaders out there need to focus on reducing the complexity of their organizations so it's more manageable. And it's really tough if you're not thinking about that as a goal and a strategy. You're gonna sprawl, no matter what.
Well, can you add a little bit of color to that? So what does that mean in terms of, like, can you give a real life example of, because I would have, if I was a CTO and of a mid-sized organization, and all the different people in an organization have their different requirements in terms of apps, data, devices, etc., and I'm pushing back and saying, no, we need to simplify. I mean, how do you manage that as an IT leader?
Well, there's a few strategies. One is obviously, sunsetting legacy platforms. A concerted effort to get rid of things that are no longer supported or end of life,
Mhm.
to reduce the footprint. Um, Maybe it's reducing the types of devices that you will support. Maybe you no longer, are going to support, I don't know, Linux laptops or Mac or Windows. Maybe you standardize around one, which is going to be easier to manage. Um, Maybe it's around it's finding one SaaS, using three SaaS platforms instead of 10. Um, Maybe it's outsourcing, right? If you look at backups and disaster recovery, instead of managing that in house, understanding how complex your environment is, maybe by outsourcing that function, you've just reduced the amount of complexity that you have to manage.
Okay, all makes a lot of sense. Hey, let's jump tracks entirely here, and as we kind of wind down this conversation, I'd like to get on to digital transformation, because it's just like cloud. It can be a very kind of a term that's very broadly used and can mean a lot of different things. But I also think that it's something that can bring tremendous amount of value, either productivity speaking, or monetarily, or security wise. Um, could you walk me through one of the more successful digital transformations that you've been involved with?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that we've done is, when you asked before about sort of our evaluation process and how long it takes to quote, and so we were talking before about more of a backup and disaster recovery scenario. But one of the other things we do is we will lift and shift our customers' applications to a public cloud or a private cloud. And when we look at the landscape of their existing servers and apps, sometimes it's not lift and shift. Sometimes we start asking them about their applications, and they're running again on old platforms, not supported. The developer quit 20 years ago,
Hmm.
and so depending on the application and its requirements, modernizing it, rewriting it on on let's say a public cloud using PaaS is going to provide a ton of additional assurances, and it will be easier to support, right? If we end up moving a specific application and we're using AWS and Lambda, that might be easier to support moving forward. And it's going to be sort of like a common currency that they can bring in additional developers in the future to work on. It might be easier to scale. And so my strategy is typically, if it's a perpetual use case, maybe it's commercial software, or it's something perpetual in nature, like a database server that has specific latency requirements or compliance requirements, or security compliance requirements. Typically, we like to put those on a private cloud because we can interconnect that back to their IT organization and make it look and feel and act like it did on-prem. If it's something that's sort of internet facing, transactional SaaS platform, then we like to use public clouds and like to leverage as much PaaS functionality as we can. And by doing so, we can develop it real fast. We can get it to market real fast. We can give them a cost model that will scale as their traffic or business grows.
Okay, makes a lot of sense. What can you tell us about Opti9 in terms of your footprint, where you are, where your customers are, and what the future holds for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have our own data centers or our own owned bare metal in about, I think it's like 12 locations throughout the world now. We're predominantly North American based. So we have multiple offices throughout the US, from the East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, same thing in Canada. We do maintain infrastructure globally though, because we have plenty of North American based organizations that are looking to outsource ownership of these services, managed cloud or disaster recovery, and work with one vendor that can provide them with data sovereignty globally. And so that's why we have infrastructure in London, in Paris, in Amsterdam, and Singapore, so they can work with one firm, and then we're adhering to GDPR and sovereignty in these different regions.
Awesome, man. Any big plans in the next year or so?
Well, I think what we've done with Observer, where we're sort of attacking, the risks associated with ransomware and security through the lens of our existing services, was successful. We're adding value and protection without having to install anything else to the client site, no agents. And I'm excited to sort of bring that same strategy to our other products and services. In fact, I think that there's a big need to protect the control plane. I think there's this huge focus on data plane. But what's actually happening in the control plane, the settings that are changed within the software, and to what extent that is normal or suspicious, you can call it observability. But for me, that's something that I'm going to focus on, and we're certainly going to have a more tighter focus on security in general too. Probably.
Is it last question on that? Is it just you're observing, or do you have any kind of anomalous detection kind of logarithm or algorithm, excuse me, where like this just you just get flagged because some unusual activity?
Oh yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. We're doing anomaly detection. We're using machine learning jobs, and we are comparing the activity to baseline, and creating the machine learning jobs will create an anomalous score. And based upon the score, the customers can, like I said before, they can have us air gap the cloud-based data. We also have an API, so we will integrate that with XDR tools and SIM tools, which is interesting because those other tools, they can then correlate everything else that they're seeing within the environment to what we're seeing within the backup software.
Right. Hey, there's some shady stuff going on here with the backups, but also in this other part, this other app, this data, something weird's going on. So probably if you put two and two together, something's bad's happening. Hey, Sagi, I've enjoyed this conversation, and I'm totally jealous that you're down in Boca Raton and I'm up here in the cloudy, rainy, dreary Pacific Northwest. But hey, I'll give you a call in August when the humidity picks up for you. Okay.
There you go. That was a great answer. All right, Mark. Thanks so much.
Hello, welcome to Secure Talk, your trusted source of information on the latest threats, trends, tools, and technology related to cybersecurity and compliance.